I'm excited for this minimalist workshop. What makes a minimalist painting? There's a lot of simplicity. There's kind of usually reduction, kind of rather than an addition of things. We're left with basic shapes and simple colors. Minimalists like to play with space, where it's like tension, direction are important. Negative space is important. They often have limited palettes, just getting by with a few. Colors, and that makes color relationships even more important because there's so few of them. We're going to look at the work of this man Joseph Albers, who really focused in on what happens when one color is put next to another color, what happens when we have a larger portion of a color and a smaller portion. We're going to talk a lot about his work and look at some examples of how we can use the knowledge of what he's taught us over the years, to make some great paintings. James Turrell, who's one of my favorite artists, was very influenced, as you can see, by Albers' theories and work, and the idea of what happens when we look at a color, what's happening with the space around it, and how optics work. So it's going to be kind of fun. We're going to talk about Albers and Turrell, and maybe you'll want to do a 2D version of a James Turrell painting, or maybe you want to experiment with Albers' kind of work. We'll go through that in class, but this kind of just shows like what can happen when you make a size larger, when you have a warm color next to a cool color, and the kind of energy that is created. It's endless, which is why people could paint the same thing over and over, like the minimalists often did. And I think it's going to be really fun to look at what happens when we swap out a red for a green and a larger black section with a smaller black section. What happens? For example, look at these. These are you can see what happens. How these the four shapes are all the same, but look at how different they are based on what colors we swap in and out, or how small we make one, or how large we make one, or how we create the negative space. How a warm color is going to come forward, cooler colors go back. We'll be playing with all of this tomorrow. It's gonna be a fun one and luckily I think it's pretty small for what we normally have, so we'll have some room to spread out. Um, when you think of tension, I always think of this like the tension of those fingers in the Sistine Chapel almost touching. Well, the minimalists have the equivalent of that. Look at these blue triangles get closer and closer until they actually touch. And that's kind of what the tension minimalist painting, this Carmen Herrera, is. Um, so we're going to look at that. We're going to look at tension and balance. We're going to look at proportion. This first sculpture here is an Antruit sculpture. And I made these, a 2D version, a digital version of this to show you. So these are the same proportions that are in that sculpture we just saw. So what happens, that proportions are on the right, but what happens if we make the green larger? What happens if we keep the pink but we swap the rest out for cool colors? What if we keep them all cool colors? Um, these are Jenny C. Jones paintings, and look at the proportion, how different this would be if that black was larger, how different this would be if that red moved over to the right more. It's really fun about minimalist is there's such an aspect of play and experimentation. Um, this is one I just made on camera, but look at, so this is when it's the triangle's going right. What happens if it goes up in the sky? What if we make that red line skinnier? What if we take those same shapes, but we fill them with colors? What happens to that white line going through? What if we soften all of them and make them ovals? There's just so much play involved in minimalism, even though they don't feel playful. We're going to look at vivid versus dull, saturated versus desaturated with Mark Rothko. Um, I mean, he really played around so much with what happens when you embed a vivid color in a sea of desaturated color. Bryce Martin did that as well. Often his work was about maybe desaturated, majority desaturated, and maybe a saturated line running through everything, and how that kind of energizes everything. So we will be talking a lot about all these things. Some techniques we'll be playing with is pouring. We'll be using some pouring paints like Helen Frankenthaler did. I have something called a wedding aid that she used, and that kind of creates those lovely melting edges that she did. We can play with fluorescence, like inspired by Dan Flavin and his neon work. It'd be fun to see the color relationships and contrasts. That's a big part of his work. We could try and play with that, see if we can capture it on a 2D canvas. We're going to experiment with edges. There was a lot of taping kind of approach to this, like Kenneth Nolan. We can actually use tape in our paintings tomorrow. And yeah, this is a great workshop if you've never used paint before, because really we're going to try so many different techniques and materials. We can tape like these great pieces. We can also do the opposite than taping. What we can do is we can kind of play with the edges, and play with our marks and kind of drips and drops, a la Jackson Pollock, or Kenneth Nolan. People that had like what happens with all these soft edges in a minimalist painting. That could be really fun too, to practice softening the edges, which is also something that Rothko did. So we can try and do more of that like burnished edge that he did, which was so fun, and we can get that by playing with mediums. Or maybe you'd like to look at the work of Agnes Martin or Mondrian and work on some grid work, which could be fun too. But I hope, you know, whatever you choose, there's a sense of playfulness and of not perfection as a goal, because we only have 2.5 hours, but also I think the reason we got this amazing period of art was because they were so willing to try new things. We're even going to have one surface that's irregular, I think. I hope we'll get to this, like Elizabeth Murray. And you can practice filling a small, irregular surface, and see how everything kind of nestles in those strange shapes and squeezed. And it's going to be really fun. I'm looking forward to it. So I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.